I need a relationship that opens doors for me socially, professionally, and financially, she explained during our final conversation together. I nodded calmly and let her walk away. Almost a year later, she attended a networking event and realized everyone there already knew my name before meeting hers. I need a relationship that opens doors for me, socially, professionally, financially. She said it like she was reading from a checklist, not like she was breaking up with me, not like we had spent 2 years building something together. Just matter of fact, clinical, like she was evaluating a vendor contract and I'd failed to meet the renewal criteria. I sat across from her at that corner table at Rosette, the restaurant she always loved, the one with the low amber lighting and the overpriced pasta she ordered every single time without looking at the menu. I remember the candle between us flickering slightly. I remember the way she folded her hands on the table like she was preparing to deliver a quarterly report. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at her, and she looked back at me, not with guilt, not with sadness, just with that particular expression she got when she believed she was being impressively rational. I nodded once, slowly, and I let her walk away. What I didn't tell her, what I had no reason to say out loud in that moment, is that the doors she was looking for someone else to open, I had already been quietly building them. For months, and almost a year later, she would walk into a room full of people who already knew my name before they ever learned hers. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 31 when it ended. She, Serena, was 29. We had been together just over 2 years, living in the same orbit of lower Manhattan ambition, both of us grinding in different industries, both of us convinced we were on the edge of something significant. I didn't realize it then, but looking back, the signs had been there from the very beginning. Not signs that she was wrong for me, exactly. Signs that we had fundamentally different understandings of what a relationship was even for. We met at a rooftop event in Tribeca, the kind of event where everyone is performing a version of themselves they haven't quite earned yet. She was standing near the railing in a green dress that caught the skyline light, talking to 2 people she clearly didn't know well, laughing at the right moments, nodding with the practiced ease of someone who had studied the geometry of social rooms. I noticed that about her first. Not her looks, though she was striking. Her awareness. She knew where the important conversations were happening. She angled herself toward them without being obvious about it. I walked over because I was curious about that quality. That kind of social calculation either comes from insecurity or from genuine ambition, and I wanted to know which version I was looking at. We talked for almost 2 hours. She was funny, sharp. She asked questions that felt real, not performative. By the end of the night, I thought, this person has actual substance. I didn't understand yet that substance and agenda aren't mutually exclusive. The first year was good, genuinely good. We were both busy, both driven, both the kind of people who get excited talking about what they're building rather than what they've accumulated. She was in brand strategy, good at it. She had clients who trusted her instincts, a growing reputation in her field, and a particular gift for walking into a room and making people feel like they'd been waiting for her without knowing it. I admired that. I told her so. What I was building was quieter, less visible. I had spent years in the background of industries that most people only see from the outside, consulting for companies that were restructuring, advising founders who were about to scale, building relationships with people whose names you'd recognize, but whose private networks you'd never see from the street. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't photograph well for LinkedIn, but it was the kind of work that compounds. Slowly, then suddenly. About 8 months in, I noticed something shift. Not dramatically, just a recalibration. Serena started asking different questions. At first they seemed casual. Do you know anyone in the acquisition space? Have you ever worked with anyone at Harlow Group? That guy you mentioned last week. Paxton, what does he actually do? I answered honestly. I introduced her to a few people when it made sense. I didn't think much of it. Couples support each other's careers. That's normal. That's healthy. But somewhere around month 11, I started noticing that the introductions flowed primarily in one direction, and that after I connected her with someone, the follow-up conversation between us was mostly about what she had gotten from that meeting, not what we had built together, not what I was working on, what she had gained. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I didn't realize it then, but she had started doing a private accounting of our relationship that I wasn't aware of. A ledger, one column for what I provided, one column for what she thought I was capable of providing. And at some point, those 2 numbers stopped matching in her head. The shift became undeniable about 3 months before the end. We were at a dinner party hosted by a colleague of hers, Holden, a media executive she'd met through a brand partnership, sharp guy, good energy, the kind of person who fills a room without trying. Holden knew me, not through Serena. We had crossed paths 2 years earlier through a restructuring project, and we'd stayed loosely in touch, the kind of connection that lives in occasional check-in texts and shared context, but no formal relationship. When Holden saw me walk in with Serena, his face registered something I noticed, but she didn't. A kind of recalculation. He came over immediately. Not to her. To me. "I didn't know you two were together," he said, glancing between us with something that might have been surprise and might have been reassessment. We talked for a while. Work stuff. A project that was gaining momentum. A few names that had recently come into my orbit. I watched Serena listen. She was smiling. But behind the smile, something was recalibrating. On the way home, she was quiet. Not upset quiet. Thinking quiet. She asked me, almost gently, why I'd never mentioned knowing Holden. "I know a lot of people," I said. "I know," she said. And there was something in her voice I couldn't quite read. Something that sounded less like admiration and more like frustration. The conversations changed after that night. Not immediately, not loudly, but she started asking more pointed questions about my work, about my network, about where I saw things going. I answered honestly. What I was building was private by design. The nature of advisory work is that you don't broadcast it. The people who matter in those rooms don't need you to announce yourself. They know. She didn't fully understand that world. And what she couldn't see, she started to resent. I think she had constructed a version of me in her mind. Capable, yes, but accessible, visible, the kind of person whose success she could attach herself to publicly. When she realized that my world didn't work that way, that its value was not performable, not postable, not something she could leverage on the surface, something in her assessment of me changed. I didn't know that at the time. I was just confused why she seemed increasingly dissatisfied with a relationship I thought was strong. The last month was strange, tense in a way that had no clear origin. We didn't fight. Serena was not a fighter. She was a withdrawer. She got quieter, more polite, politely distant, which, if you've ever experienced it, you know is somehow colder than anger. I asked her twice if something was wrong. She said no both times. She said it the way people say it when the real answer is fully formed, but they're still deciding how to deliver it. I gave her space. I kept moving forward in my own work. And then one evening, she asked if we could have dinner at Rosette. I knew something was happening. I said yes. She sat down across from me, ordered her pasta without looking at the menu, and waited until the wine arrived to say it. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I nodded. "I think I need to be honest with you." "Okay," I said. "I think I need a relationship that does more for me." I waited. Not just emotionally. I mean, that's important, but I need something that opens doors for me. Socially, professionally, financially. I need a partner who's going to elevate my world. She said it carefully, rehearsed, like she'd been practicing it in the mirror for a week. I looked at her for a long moment. There was a version of that conversation where I laid out exactly what I had been building, where I explained the network, the projects, the people, the doors that were about to open, and the fact that I had been slowly constructing a key that would open all of them simultaneously. I could have said all of that. I chose not to. Because if she needed a relationship to be transactional, if the value I brought had to be visible, performance-ready, easily measured, then nothing I said in that moment would actually change what she believed about us. I nodded. Once. Slowly. "I hear you," I said. She looked slightly surprised, like she'd expected a defense. "I think you should do what's right for you," I said. We sat there for a few more minutes. We finished the wine. We split the bill. And then she walked away from the table. I watched her go. The candle flickered once, and then steadied. The first week after it ended, I felt the specific quiet that comes after a long, slow unraveling finally stops. Not relief, exactly. Not grief either. Just still. I went back to work. I had 3 projects running in parallel at the time. An advisory engagement with a media company that was restructuring its executive team, a consulting role with a tech founder named Qley who was about to close a Series B that everyone in the room knew would significantly reshape a corner of the market, and a longer-term relationship with a private equity group that had been quietly watching an industry consolidation and was about to make a move that nobody outside the room had heard about. Yet, none of these were things I talked about at dinner parties. None of them were things I posted about. But they were real, and they were building towards something. About 6 weeks after Serena and I ended, I got a call from Paxton. Paxton was one of those people whose name operates like a door in certain rooms. He ran an accelerator program that had produced 3 notable exits in 4 years. He was selective to the point of being almost inaccessible. We had developed a genuine working friendship over 18 months, the kind that starts with one good conversation and builds through consistent follow-through on both sides. He called because the media company I was advising had just made a hire he was interested in, and he wanted my red. We talked for 40 minutes. At the end of the call, he said something I didn't think much of at the time. I'm putting together a small event in a couple months. Nothing formal. The right 30 people in a room. I want you there. Sure, I said. Send me the details. I went back to work. The project with Qley closed out beautifully. Not dramatically. These things rarely are dramatic on the inside. They're just work, done well, over time. But the result was that when the announcement went out, my name was attached to the outcome in the way that matters in advisory work. Not publicly, not loudly, but in the room where the next conversation happens. The people who needed to know, knew. The private equity engagement moved into its final phase. The consolidation they'd been watching came through. I was in 3 rooms I couldn't have been in a year earlier. Not because I'd chased them, because the work had compounded. Slowly, then suddenly. Exactly the way it was always going to. About 9 months after the dinner at Rosette, I got a text from Holden. He was hosting a networking event. His description was curated chaos, which was very Holden. About 60 people. A mix of media, tech, and finance. The kind of room where the connections made at the event would generate conversations for the next 2 years. He wanted me there. He wanted me to say a few words, not a speech. More of an informal conversation starter about what was shifting in the advisory landscape. I said yes. The event was held at a venue in the meatpacking district. Good space. High ceilings. Exposed brick and good lighting. The kind of room where you feel like important things are already in progress before you've said a word. I got there early. Talked to a few people I knew well. Met a few I didn't. About 40 minutes in, Holden pulled me into a small cluster of people near the window. He was mid-introduction as I walked over. And this is... I looked up. Serena was standing in the cluster. She saw me at almost the same moment. Her expression moved through several things in about 2 seconds. Surprise. Recalibration. And then, something softer and harder to name. Oh, she said. Hi. Hi, I said. Holden looked between us with the practiced ease of someone who does not acknowledge awkwardness, ever. He finished the introductions around the circle, and then moved naturally into conversation. What happened over the next 30 minutes, I only understood fully when Serena told me about it weeks later. She had come to the event through a connection she'd made recently, someone in the brand space who had mentioned it as a good room to be in. She'd come to network, to meet people, to be in the kind of room that, by her own framework, would open doors for her. What she hadn't expected was to spend most of that room hearing her ex-boyfriend's name before being introduced to him. Holden had mentioned me in his opening remarks. Not effusively, just naturally. The way you mention someone whose presence in the room is already understood. The founder she'd been introduced to early in the evening, Bridger, a tech operator she'd sat next to near the entrance, had said, within the first 5 minutes of conversation, "Do you know me? He's the reason this project even got off the ground. We wouldn't be in this room without the foundation he helped build." She had smiled politely and said no. Actually, she didn't know me. Bridger had looked mildly surprised. He'd moved on, but she hadn't. She told me later that she'd spent the rest of the evening doing a kind of private archaeology, listening to how my name came up. In what context? With what kind of weight? Not as self-promotion. Not as networking theater. Just as a foundational fact in rooms where important things were being built. And she said something to me, weeks later, when we ran into each other again and had a real conversation for the first time since Rosette, that I have thought about more than once since then. She said, "I kept waiting for someone to introduce you as their connection, as someone they'd brought into the room. But no one did. You were just already there, already known, like the room had been built around you without anyone saying it out loud." She asked me, in that later conversation, if I'd been angry. At the dinner. At the way she'd ended things. I thought about it honestly. No, I said. Why not? Because you were honest, I said. And you were right about what you needed. You just had the wrong read on what I was. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I figured that out somewhere around the 3rd time someone said your name before I'd introduced myself. Here is the thing about what Serena wanted that I've spent time thinking about since. She wasn't wrong to want a partner who elevated her world. That's not an unreasonable thing to want. The error wasn't in the wanting. The error was in the metric. She had built her entire framework around visibility. If she couldn't see it, it didn't exist. If it wasn't announced, it hadn't happened. If the doors weren't already open and labeled, they weren't real doors. What she never understood, what she perhaps still doesn't fully understand, is that the most significant doors are never labeled. They don't have signs. They're opened by people who don't need to announce the opening. And the access they provide doesn't show up on a surface you can photograph. It shows up years later, in a room you didn't expect to be in, with people saying a name you didn't realize you should have paid more attention to. I'm not telling this story as a corrective, not as a lesson about underestimating quiet people, or the virtue of working in private, or any of that. I'm telling it because that final dinner at Rosette has stayed with me in a particular way. Not because of the pain of it. There was pain, don't misread the calm I've described, but because of what it clarified, about what I was actually building, about the difference between people who want to be adjacent to value and people who want to create it, about the fact that the version of success she was looking for, visible, attached, borrowable, is fundamentally different from the version I had been quietly assembling. She wanted a relationship that opened doors. What I had been doing, without fully naming it, was becoming the person who builds them. The last time I saw Serena in a professional context was at another event, about 4 months after the Holden evening. She was with someone. New relationship, seemed decent, the kind of visible, publicly successful man she had described wanting. She looked well. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. The kind that carries more information than a nod should be capable of carrying. I nodded back. No hostility. No performance. Just acknowledgement. Two people who had been honest with each other, arriving separately at rooms they each needed to be in. Colt texted me that same night after the event. The Series B had formally closed. He was putting together a small dinner for the people who had made it real. Not a celebration exactly, just a gathering of the handful of individuals whose work, across different stages, had made the outcome possible. My name was on the list. I told him I'd be there. I put my phone down and looked out the window at the city for a moment. Then I went back to work. She said she needed a relationship that opened doors. I nodded and let her walk away. What I didn't say, what I had no reason to say, is that I wasn't a door. I was the architect.